The boarding gate buzzed with typical airport chaos. Flight attendant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her pristine uniform and checked her watch. Flight 447 to Chicago was running behind schedule, and her patience was wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need assistance boarding," wheezed an elderly man approaching her counter. His weathered hands gripped a walking cane, and his faded military jacket hung loosely on his frail frame. Sarah barely glanced up from her clipboard. "Sir, you should have requested wheelchair assistance when you booked your ticket. We're already delayed. Please, I just need someone to help me down the jetway. My legs aren't what they used to be." "That's not my responsibility. You'll have to figure it out yourself or wait for the next flight." Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge of irritation that comes from dealing with hundreds of passengers daily. The old man's shoulders sagged. Other passengers in line shifted uncomfortably, watching the scene unfold. A few pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where we explore the moments that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of recognizing the heroes walking among us. Today's story reveals how sometimes the most important person in the room is the one we overlook entirely. Let's uncover what really happened when prejudice met providence at 30,000 feet. Sarah Mitchell had been working for Atlantic Airways for 8 years. She prided herself on efficiency and following protocols to the letter. In her mind, passengers who came unprepared were simply creating unnecessary delays. She had seen every sob story, every excuse, every attempt to bend the rules. At 29, Sarah lived alone in a downtown apartment, her life structured around flight schedules and overtime pay. She had worked her way up from baggage handler to senior flight attendant through sheer determination and an unwavering adherence to company policies. Personal connections felt like luxuries she couldn't afford. The elderly passenger she had just dismissed stood at the gate, watching other travelers board effortlessly. His name was Harold Thompson, though Sarah never bothered to ask. At 84, Harold had survived battles that most people only read about in history books. But today, he was just another inconvenient passenger threatening her on-time departure record. Harold slowly made his way toward the jetway, each step deliberate and painful. His arthritis flared in the air-conditioned terminal, making every movement a calculated effort. Behind him, impatient passengers muttered about the delay. "This is ridiculous," one businessman complained loudly. "Why didn't he arrange for help ahead of time?" Harold heard the comments but continued forward. He had faced worse criticism than this, much worse. Captain James Rodriguez was conducting his final pre-flight checks when he noticed the boarding delay. Through the cockpit window, he watched an elderly man struggling down the jetway, alone and moving at a painstaking pace. "What's the hold-up back there?" he radioed to Sarah. "Just an unprepared passenger, Captain. He'll manage eventually." Rodriguez frowned. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. He made a decision that would change everything. "I'm coming back to check on things." The captain emerged from the cockpit and immediately spotted Harold, now halfway down the jetway, breathing heavily and gripping the handrail for support. Rodriguez approached quickly. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need assistance?" Harold looked up, surprised by the kindness in the pilot's voice. "I'm fine, son. Just moving a bit slower than I used to." "What's your name, sir?" "Harold Thompson." Captain Rodriguez stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened as he processed the name. Harold Thompson wasn't just any passenger, he was a living piece of American history. "Are you Harold Thompson from the 101st Airborne?" Harold nodded quietly. "I was, a long time ago." Rodriguez felt his chest tighten. He had studied military history extensively and knew exactly who stood before him. Harold Thompson wasn't just a veteran, he was a decorated war hero who had saved countless lives during World War II and Korea. The captain immediately turned toward the boarding area and spoke into his radio with unmistakable authority. "All crew members, this is your captain speaking. I need absolute silence in the cabin immediately. We have a very special passenger boarding today." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, confused by the sudden change in her captain's demeanor. The boarding area fell quiet as Rodriguez's voice carried through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention, please. We have the honor of having a true American hero aboard our flight today. Staff Sergeant Harold Thompson served our country with extraordinary valor in World War II and Korea." Harold's face flushed with embarrassment. "Captain, that's not necessary." "Yes, sir, it absolutely is." Rodriguez continued addressing the passengers and crew. "Sergeant Thompson received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the Battle of the Bulge, where he single-handedly rescued 12 wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. In Korea, he led a mission that saved an entire platoon from being overrun." The jetway had gone completely silent. Passengers who had been grumbling moments before now watched Harold with newfound respect. Several stood up spontaneously. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the magnitude of her earlier dismissal. This wasn't just any elderly passenger, this was a genuine war hero, and she had treated him like an inconvenience. "Furthermore," Captain Rodriguez continued, his voice growing stronger, "Sergeant Thompson spent 30 years after his military service working with veterans suffering from PTSD, helping them transition back to civilian life. He founded 3 different support programs that are still running today." Harold tried to wave off the attention, but Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to personally escort you to your seat, and I think I speak for everyone when I say we're honored to share this flight with you." Applause erupted throughout the cabin. Passengers stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Some wiped away tears. The businessman who had complained earlier was now on his feet, applauding louder than anyone. Harold accepted the captain's arm and walked slowly toward his seat. With each step, passengers reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Words of gratitude filled the air. "Thank you for your service. We're honored to meet you. You're a true hero." Harold smiled gently at each person, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. This wasn't the reception he had expected when he boarded the plane alone and unassisted. Sarah watched from the galley, her face burning with shame. She had worked in customer service long enough to recognize dignity when she saw it, yet she had completely missed it in Harold. Her efficiency-focused mindset had blinded her to the person standing right in front of her. As Harold settled into his seat, Captain Rodriguez made one final announcement. "Before we take off, I want everyone to know that Sergeant Thompson is traveling to Chicago to receive recognition at a veterans ceremony tomorrow. He's being honored for his decades of service both in uniform and as a civilian advocate for our military families." The applause resumed, even louder than before. Harold raised a shaky hand in acknowledgement, overwhelmed by the unexpected outpouring of gratitude. Sarah approached Harold's seat, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine remorse. "Sergeant Thompson, I owe you a sincere apology. I was completely wrong to treat you the way I did. There's no excuse for my behavior." Harold looked up at her with kind eyes that held no anger, only understanding. "Young lady, we all have difficult days. What matters is how we choose to move forward. I should have helped you immediately. I should have seen past my own frustrations." "You see me now," Harold replied simply. "That's what counts." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Is there anything I can do to make this right?" Harold considered her question carefully. "Just remember that every person you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. Some of those stories might surprise you." Throughout the flight, passengers continued approaching Harold to express their gratitude. He shared stories about his fellow soldiers, always deflecting praise and highlighting the sacrifices others had made. His humility only made his heroism more apparent. A young mother traveling with her son asked Harold to sign her boy's baseball cap. A college student requested a photo to send to her grandfather, also a veteran. An elderly woman simply held his hand and whispered, "Thank you." Sarah observed these interactions while performing her duties, learning more about genuine service in 2 hours than she had in 8 years of following protocols. As the flight prepared for landing in Chicago, Captain Rodriguez made one last announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, As we begin our descent into Chicago, I want to remind everyone that heroes don't always wear capes or receive recognition. Sometimes they're sitting right next to us, quietly carrying the weight of extraordinary experiences. He paused, looking directly at Harold. Sergeant Thompson, thank you for your service to our country and for reminding us all what true character looks like. The plane erupted in applause once more. Harold wiped his eyes with a handkerchief his late wife had embroidered decades earlier. After landing, every passenger waited respectfully as Harold disembarked first, assisted by Captain Rodriguez and 2 other crew members. Sarah stood at the door, offering her hand as he passed. Sergeant Thompson, meeting you has changed how I see my job and how I see people. Thank you for that lesson. Harold squeezed her hand gently. Sarah, you have the power to make every passenger feel valued. That's a tremendous gift. As Harold walked through the Chicago terminal, several passengers from the flight continued accompanying him, unwilling to let the moment end. The businessman who had initially complained now carried Harold's bag and was sharing stories about his own father's military service. Sarah remained on the plane, processing what had happened. She had begun the day focused solely on schedules and efficiency. She was ending it with a completely transformed perspective on what it meant to serve others. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work 30 minutes early. She had spent the night researching Harold Thompson and learning about his remarkable life. The internet was filled with stories of his battlefield heroics and his post-war advocacy work. But what struck her most were the testimonials from veterans whose lives he had touched. Her supervisor approached with the daily briefing. Sarah, I heard about yesterday's flight. Sounds like quite an experience. It was life-changing, she replied honestly. I realized I've been doing my job but not serving people. From that day forward, Sarah approached every passenger interaction differently. She looked for ways to help rather than reasons to say no. She learned names instead of just seat numbers. She recognized that behind every ticket was a human being with their own story, struggles, and dignity. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Harold Thompson. He was writing to thank her for the follow-up letter she had sent after their flight and to share news about the Veterans Program he was expanding in Chicago. Dear Sarah, the letter began, your willingness to grow from our encounter gives me hope for the next generation. You reminded an old soldier that mistakes don't define us, our responses to them do. He concluded with words that Sarah would frame and keep on her desk. True service isn't about following rules perfectly. It's about seeing the humanity in every person you encounter and responding with compassion. Harold Thompson passed away peacefully 18 months later, surrounded by the veterans he had mentored and the family members who loved him. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, including several passengers from Flight 447 and one flight attendant who had learned the most important lesson of her career from an elderly man who just needed help boarding a plane. The story of Flight 447 reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unacknowledged. Harold Thompson's military decorations were impressive, but his true legacy lived in the compassion he showed others and the grace with which he handled both recognition and dismissal. Sarah Mitchell still works for Atlantic Airways, but her approach to passenger service has inspired changes throughout the company. She established a program that trains staff to recognize and appropriately honor military veterans, ensuring that Harold Thompson's experience would never happen again. More importantly, she learned that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their apparent status or our own daily pressures. The elderly passenger struggling with mobility could be a war hero. The nervous flyer might be traveling to say goodbye to a dying parent. The difficult customer could be dealing with challenges we can't imagine. In our rush to maintain efficiency and meet expectations, we sometimes forget that our greatest impact comes not from perfect adherence to procedures, but from moments of genuine human connection. Harold Thompson understood this truth deeply, which is why he responded to Sarah's initial dismissal with forgiveness rather than anger. His story challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the extraordinary within the ordinary. It reminds us that true heroism often involves quiet acts of service that go unnoticed by history books but change individual lives forever. The next time you encounter someone who seems to need a little extra patience or kindness, remember Harold Thompson. Remember that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply ask for a little help boarding the plane. And sometimes, if we're fortunate enough to recognize them, they end up teaching us far more than we could ever teach them about what it truly means to serve others with dignity, compassion, and grace.